wartime zone. At 0340 hours local time on a brutally cold night in early 2026, a fully loaded Russian freight train thundered through one of the last remaining single-track bottlenecks on the Trans-Siberian Railway, the vital iron artery that snaked over 9,000 kilometers from Vladivostok to Moscow, carrying hundreds of tons of North Korean-supplied munitions destined for the grinding fronts in eastern Ukraine. Deep inside Russian territory, thousands of kilometers from the border, the train crew had no inkling that their routine run was about to end in a cataclysm of fire and twisted steel. Unseen in the frozen darkness ahead, a small Ukrainian special operations team, call sign Phantom, had spent months infiltrating across vast hostile expanses to reach this precise location near Khabarovsk in Russia's far east, placing a dozen specialized incendiary charges designed to burn at temperatures hot enough to liquefy hardened R-65 rails and sever the tracks like a blowtorch through butter. What unfolded over the next hour wasn't just a daring act of sabotage but a strategic masterstroke that exposed the fragility of Russia's sprawling logistics empire, disrupted ammunition flows for weeks, and sent shockwaves through Moscow's command structure, proving once again that Ukrainian special forces could strike anywhere, turning perceived safe havens into vulnerable choke points and forcing Russia to confront the reality that no supply line, no matter how remote or fortified, was beyond reach in a war where distance no longer guaranteed security. The operation, codenamed Siberian Shadow, traced its origins to intelligence breakthroughs in mid-2025, when Ukrainian reconnaissance, long-range drones, satellite imagery, human sources embedded in Russian rail networks, and signals intercepts revealed Russia's growing dependence on North Korean munitions delivered via Vladivostok and routed west along the Trans-Siberian. With domestic production strained by sanctions and Western strikes on factories, Pyongyang's shipments, hundreds of thousands of 122mm and 152mm shells, Grad rockets, mortar rounds, had become a lifeline sustaining the relentless artillery barrages that defined Russian tactics. The railway's bottlenecks, particularly single-track sections east of the Urals where dual lines converged for maintenance or terrain reasons, concentrated this flow. One disruption could delay thousands of tons for weeks, cascading shortages to fronts where artillery superiority was Moscow's primary advantage. Ukrainian planners in the Main Directorate of Intelligence, HUR, identified the Khabarovsk junction, remote, lightly defended, vital, as the ideal target. Severing it forced detours via the parallel Baikal-Amur mainline, BM, adding 1,400 kilometers and burning precious fuel Russia couldn't spare in winter conditions that already strained transport. Execution demanded extraordinary infiltration, a months-long odyssey that tested the team's physical, mental, and technical limits. Direct entry through Russia's western borders was impossible. FSB biometric scans at checkpoints, facial recognition cameras, watch lists tied to passport data, and random vehicle searches made legal crossings suicide for operatives with Ukrainian ties. The route chosen was a clandestine network pieced together through sympathetic agents in Kazakhstan, facilitating border crossings via remote steppe routes, Mongolia, leveraging vast taiga for evasion, and into Russia's far east. Total distance over 5,000 kilometers navigated covertly, often on foot or by stolen vehicles, using safe houses for rest and resupply. The team of 4 operators, veterans of earlier deep strikes like the 2024 Crimea Bridge sabotage and 2025 Rostov Depot raid, carried their payload in backpacks, a dozen thermite-based incendiary charges, each weighing under a kilogram but capable of sustained 1,370 degrees Celsius burns exploiting steel's structural failure point at rail joints where wheel impacts maximize stress. These devices, developed indigenously with Western thermite formulas, ignited self-sustaining reactions impossible to extinguish, ensuring complete severance even if discovered post-placement. Challenges began at the Mongolian-Russian border, where unexpected FSB biometric checkpoints, fingerprint scanners, iris recognition, databases cross-referenced with facial scans, forced a 25-kilometer detour through taiga at -35 degrees Celsius, where lithium batteries in GPS units drained in hours, circuit boards cracked from thermal contraction, LCD screens froze solid. The team wrapped critical devices in chemical heating pads scavenged from 8 kits, managing reserves meticulously to preserve detonators and timing circuits rated for -20 degrees Celsius maximum. Approaching the target, previously unknown Russian electronic warfare jammers, Krasuka 4 variants deployed to protect rail corridors, disrupted GPS precision needed for charge placement at exact stress points. Switching to compass and paper maps turned hours into days, manual navigation through featureless snowfields where every kilometer took 40 minutes instead of 15, timelines compressing dangerously. Local police detained one operator at a routine checkpoint 200 kilometers from the site. Cover story as a Mongolian trader, held but interrogation dragged hours, risking exposure. Maintenance windows limited opportunities. Wednesday through Thursday nights offered 90-minute gaps when unexplained activity was least suspicious. Missing meant waiting 7 days. Unacceptable with confirmed ammunition train scheduled for November 13th, carrying 1,200 tons of North Korean shells that could sustain a major Donetsk offensive. At 0215 hours on November 13th, the team reached the junction through dense pine forests and along disused sidings, night vision goggles turning world green and ghostly. Immediate obstacle, unscheduled security patrol 200 meters away, engine idling, cigarette smoke drifting in frozen air, patrol not due for 3 hours. Diversion created. One operator set small fire in abandoned maintenance shed using accelerant, drawing patrol racing toward flames. Window bought, but tight. Placing 12 charges across 400 meters could take 20 minutes. Team cut corners, skipping some backup sensors, each shortcut increasing failure risk. As patrol radioed incident, team worked frantically, splicing detonation cord with numbed fingers, positioning at joints where 25-ton axle loads maximize stress. 9 charges placed, 3 left, patrol returning back up en route. Train rumbled distant but early, pushing 80 kilometers per hour through darkness. Last charge connected as locomotive engineer spotted figures in fluoroscope. Emergency braking too late. Detonator pressed. 12 charges ignited simultaneously, brilliant white stars erupting, thermite reactions self-sustaining, steel liquefying at joints. Locomotive hit first gap at 52 kilometers per hour. Front wheels dropped into void, metal screamed, entire engine lurched violently, couplings snapped like twine. Behind, 23 freight cars jackknifed in sequence, containers breaking, crates spilling, 1,200 tons munitions scattered across frozen ground like dropped coins. No massive detonation, modern shells stable, packaged against undue discharge, but total loss. Exposed, undeliverable, vulnerable to weather and follow-on strikes. Russian response chaotic. Emergency vehicles arrived to find crew survived, miraculous in crash, but evidence defied assumptions. Precision burns at stress points, simultaneous ignition, no accidental cause. State media blamed technical malfunction, touting scheduled repairs, vague, unconvincing as images circulated via locals and smuggled videos. Investigative committee opened probe but found no terrorist evidence to avoid admitting Ukrainian reach. Repair impossible quickly. Section needed complete replacement, BM detour overloaded lower volume line, delaying shipments weeks. Fuel burned on reroutes Russia couldn't spare in winter. Psychological blow profound, untouchable homeland violated 6,600 kilometers away, conscripts from East questioning if family's safe. North Korean partnership exposed. Munitions shipped across sea/rail at great cost destroyed in Russia's backyard. Pyongyang embarrassed, diplomatic strain as reliable ally, failed protection. Because small teams with determination achieve what massive forces cannot. 4 operators months infiltrating, precise charges turning one train into disruption divisions/air squadrons might fail to match. Operations elegance and leverage. Minimal resources, team of 4 portable charges, disrupting maximal effect. Weeks ammunition delay, months reconfiguration. Without confrontation/high casualties. Massive forces visible/predictable/vulnerable to counter. Small team shadow strike where least expected. This principle, leverage through minimal disrupting maximal, defined Ukrainian SOF success. Earlier missions hit bridges in occupied territory, deeper penetrations targeted depots, Trans-Siberian pushed boundaries, proving distance no guarantee. Because determination in shadows achieves what force in light cannot. And Ukrainian SOF remain key, turning quantitative superiority into nightmare. Exploiting fixed infrastructure, predictable patterns, centralized control creating failure points. The operation's legacy. Russian logistics forever altered. Guards increased but insufficient for 9,000 kilometers line. Patrols doubled, straining manpower. Resources perpetually diverted to protection rather than offense. But vast territory meant gaps persisted. Ukrainian teams finding new targets. The Trans-Siberian sabotage near Khabarovsk in early 2026 left an indelible mark on Russian military logistics. fundamentally altering how Moscow approached the protection of its sprawling railway network and forcing a permanent shift in resource allocation that weakened offensive capabilities across multiple fronts. In the immediate aftermath, Russian authorities reacted with predictable urgency. Guards along the Trans-Siberian and parallel BM lines increased dramatically, with additional security detachments deployed at every major junction, bridge, and tunnel. Patrol frequency doubled. Foot patrols, vehicle sweeps, and drone overwatch became routine, especially during the critical winter months when repair delays were most punishing. Mobile rapid reaction teams, equipped with armored vehicles, night vision, and electronic detection gear, stationed at strategic points, while railway maintenance crews now traveled under armed escort, turning routine inspections into armed convoys that consumed manpower and fuel. Yet these measures proved insufficient for the 9,000-kilometer line scale, a vastness that no combination of increased manpower, technological upgrades, or administrative reorganization could ever fully conquer. The Trans-Siberian Railway, even with the parallel Baikal-Amur mainline (BM) providing some redundancy, represented an impossible perimeter to secure completely. Thousands upon thousands of kilometers snaking through remote taiga forests where the nearest human settlement might be hours or days away, across rugged mountain ranges like the Sayan and Stanovoy, over frozen tundra expanses in Yakutia and Chukotka where population density dropped to near 0 inhabitants per square kilometer, and along river valleys prone to seasonal flooding and ice jams. This was not a border fence or urban perimeter that could be patrolled with overlapping shifts and constant surveillance. It was a linear artery cutting through some of the harshest, most inhospitable terrain on Earth, where infrastructure remained vulnerable at countless isolated points, bridges over raging rivers, tunnels through permafrost, culverts under avalanche-prone slopes, and switches in the middle of nowhere that could be severed with a few kilograms of precisely placed incendiary. The weather conditions alone made constant coverage logistically nightmarish. Blizzards with wide-out visibility could halt patrols for days, burying tracks in meters of snow and forcing crews to wait for clear weather before even attempting inspection. Temperatures plunging to -50°C and below turned metal brittle, drained batteries in vehicles and electronics within hours, froze lubricants in machinery, and made human endurance a limiting factor. Patrols limited to short shifts before frostbite set in, requiring heated shelters that themselves became fixed points needing protection. Avalanches in mountain sections could bury tracks for weeks, requiring heavy equipment that had to be transported from distant bases, while spring thaw turned taiga roads into impassable mud, isolating sections for months. These environmental realities meant that even with guards increased dramatically after the Khabarovsk sabotage, effective coverage remained patchy at best. Patrols could perhaps cover 10 to 20 kilometers effectively per shift before fatigue, weather, or mechanical failure forced return to base, leaving vast stretches unguarded for hours or days between passes. Manpower strain became acute and self-reinforcing. Units pulled from combat rotations in Ukraine, experienced Spetsnaz teams, motorized rifle battalions, engineering companies, were redeployed eastward to augment railway security, creating immediate shortages in Donetsk, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhia where every soldier was desperately needed to hold lines or conduct counterattacks. Rear area security in European Russia, already stretched by internal dissent and sabotage threats, saw further depletion as internal troops transferred to Siberia, leaving key depots and transport hubs in the western military districts under strength. The redeployment itself consumed resources. Trains moving thousands of troops across the country diverted rolling stock from ammunition transport, fuel burn transporting personnel and equipment to remote bases, logistics chains strained supporting distant garrisons with food, medical supplies, and winter gear in areas where resupply depended on the very railways they were protecting. Security forces, Spetsnaz operators trained for deep raids and hostage rescue, FSB border guards specialized in counterintelligence, Interior Ministry internal troops accustomed to riot control and occupation duties, found themselves assigned to monotonous patrols along frozen tracks, guarding junctions in temperatures that made even basic movement painful, responding to every suspicious sighting that often proved to be wildlife or weather-induced false alarms. The mismatch between training and task eroded morale. Elite operators who had conducted night raids behind enemy lines now spent weeks in isolation watching snow fall, their skills rusting while frontline comrades faced constant combat. Conscripts and mobilized reservists from the same eastern regions, already questioning the war's purpose, now guarded the very lines that brought supplies to their own families, creating cognitive dissonance that fed resentment and desertion risks. Fuel and supplies consumed by endless patrols diverted from frontline needs in ways that compounded over time. Every patrol vehicle, armored Ural trucks, snowmobiles, helicopters, burned diesel that could have powered tanks or artillery tractors in Donbass. Spare parts for these vehicles, already scarce due to sanctions, prioritized for Eastern security, left shortages at front. Maintenance backlogs grew as engineering teams split between repairs and protection. Crews that once restored battle-damaged bridges in hours now spent weeks replacing rails in permafrost, delaying offensive preparations as winter froze ground solid and complicated excavation. The diversion created opportunity costs that accumulated relentlessly. Every ruble spent on railway guards was a ruble not spent on shells, drones, or troop rotations. Every soldier patrolling Taiga was a soldier not holding trench or conducting assault. Every hour of engineering effort in Siberia was an hour not spent fortifying forward positions or building crossing sites for planned spring offensives. Russian quantitative superiority, more troops, more equipment, more infrastructure, became self-limiting when forced into defensive posture, protecting lines too long to defend perfectly. The Trans-Siberian and BAM together spanned over 10,000 kilometers through terrain that included permafrost, mountains, taiga, rivers, and tundra, requiring constant vigilance that no amount of troops could provide without leaving other sectors exposed. Increased guards and patrols thinned coverage elsewhere, creating new gaps that Ukrainian special forces could exploit with renewed drone strikes, sabotage, or intelligence gathering. Every additional security measure diverted resources from offense. Engineering battalions building defensive lines instead of bridges for advances, Spetsnaz guarding depots instead of conducting raids, internal troops protecting railways instead of suppressing resistance in occupied territories. The defensive posture became self-reinforcing. More protection required more resources diverted meant weaker offense. Weaker offense allowed Ukrainian forces breathing room to plan next deep strike. Next deep strike created more need for protection. This cycle, quantity forcing defensive reallocation that weakened offense, creating opportunities for further Ukrainian disruption, defined the war's asymmetric dimension. Russian superiority required sustaining vast networks. Disrupting one node forced protection of all, turning mass into burden. Ukrainian special operations exploited this. Small teams striking where mass couldn't protect, forcing Russia into defensive spiral that drained resources, eroded morale, and delayed offensives. The Khabarovsk incident wasn't isolated. It triggered pattern where each successful deep strike forced greater protection. Greater protection created new vulnerabilities invited further strikes. The legacy extended to strategic thinking. Russian commanders now planned with constant rear area anxiety, allocating forces to protection rather than concentration, hesitating on offensives fearing supply disruption, political leadership facing domestic questions about homeland security. The sabotage didn't just delay trains, it delayed victory narrative, eroded confidence, exposed limits of quantitative approach against qualitative adaptability. Resources perpetually diverted to protection rather than offense compounded the damage in ways that rippled through Russia's entire war machine, creating a slow-bleeding strategic hemorrhage that no amount of manpower or industrial output could fully staunch. The Trans-Siberian sabotage near Khabarovsk in early 2026 forced Moscow into a defensive spiral where resources once dedicated to forward momentum now poured into rear-area security and repair efforts, turning what should have been a temporary inconvenience into a long-term structural weakness that undermined offensive planning across multiple fronts. Engineering battalions that once built pontoon bridges for Donetsk offensives, rapidly assembling temporary crossings over rivers and flooded fields to enable armored advances, now spent months replacing rails and sleepers in remote Siberian sections. Their heavy equipment and skilled crews redirected thousands of kilometers eastward where winter froze ground solid, complicated excavation, and turned routine repairs into grueling, time-consuming ordeals. These units, trained and equipped for offensive engineering, rapid bridging, road building, fortification construction, found themselves performing the defensive role of infrastructure restoration under conditions that maximized inefficiency. Permafrost requiring specialized thawing equipment, blizzards halting work for days, supply lines stretched thin across taiga where fuel deliveries arrived irregularly. Each week spent fixing rails was a week not spent preparing for spring offensives, delaying the assembly of pontoon parks, the prepositioning of bridging materials, and the training of engineers in forward areas where their skills were most needed. The diversion extended beyond engineering to security forces. Spetsnaz units, FSB border guards, internal troops, and even mobilized reservists, stretched across new Eastern commitments that pulled them from more pressing roles in ways that created cascading weaknesses throughout the Russian military apparatus. Spetsnaz teams, elite operators trained for the most demanding missions, Deep raids behind Ukrainian lines to destroy command posts, sabotage supply depots, capture high-value targets, or secure critical infrastructure in Donetsk and Luhansk, now found themselves assigned to endless patrols along remote railway sections in Siberia and the Far East, guarding isolated junctions, inspecting tracks for signs of sabotage, and responding to every suspicious sighting reported by local authorities or automated sensors. These were not the high-intensity operations Spetsnaz had prepared for over decades. Instead, they involved long hours in sub-zero temperatures, monotonous foot patrols along snow-covered rails where the greatest threat was frostbite rather than enemy fire, and the constant tedium of waiting for something to happen in areas where weeks could pass without incident. The redeployment stripped frontline units of their most capable special operators precisely when they were needed most. During the winter of 2025 to 2026, when Russian forces planned renewed offensives in Donbass and Kharkiv, operations that required the kind of reconnaissance, direct action, and disruption Spetsnaz excelled at. Without these teams, planned raids on Ukrainian artillery positions, supply hubs, and command nodes were scaled back or postponed, reducing pressure on Ukrainian defenses and allowing Kyiv to regroup and reinforce. FSB border guards traditionally focused on western frontiers, securing the long land border with Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, and the Baltic states against infiltration, smuggling, and espionage, were redeployed east to augment railway security in numbers that diluted their specialized expertise across vast distances where threats were sporadic but potentially catastrophic. These units, trained in counterintelligence, surveillance, and rapid response to border incidents, now spent shifts patrolling sections of track hundreds of kilometers from the nearest population center, monitoring remote junctions for signs of tampering, and coordinating with local police on suspicious activity. Their skills, linguistic capabilities for interrogations, technical knowledge for detecting hidden explosives, experience in setting up observation posts, were wasted in environments where the primary challenge was environmental rather than operational. The redeployment left western border security thinner, creating opportunities for Ukrainian intelligence to insert agents or gather information along traditional infiltration routes, while eastern patrols struggled with the sheer scale. One FSB detachment might cover 200 to 300 kilometers of track with only a handful of vehicles, meaning gaps of hours or days between inspections in areas where weather and terrain already complicated movement. Internal troops, Interior Ministry forces responsible for rear area stability, occupation duties, riot control, and securing key infrastructure in occupied territories, faced similar strain. Battalions that once patrolled occupied cities like Mariupol or Melitopol, suppressed dissent in Donetsk, or guarded military convoys now guarded train depots and repair yards in Siberia, their numbers insufficient to cover every kilometer but large enough to create significant manpower drain from other sectors. These troops, often less elite than Spetsnaz but numerous and equipped for static security, were pulled from duties supporting occupation administration and frontline reinforcement, leaving gaps in rear area control that Ukrainian partisans and special forces exploited with sabotage and intelligence collection. The redeployment meant internal troops in Ukraine were stretched thinner, reducing ability to suppress resistance, protect supply lines, or maintain order in occupied areas where discontent simmered. The cumulative effect was a hollowing out of offensive capability across multiple domains. Counteroffensives planned for Donbass, operations requiring special forces for deep reconnaissance, sabotage of Ukrainian artillery positions, and disruption of command and control, were delayed as Spetsnaz teams unavailable for those missions, their expertise instead wasted on railway patrols where any threat was more likely weather than enemy action. Deep strikes into Ukrainian-held territory, raids targeting fuel depots, ammunition storage, and headquarters, reduced as operators reassigned to eastern security, leaving Russian forces more reactive than proactive in contested areas. Defensive lines in Kharkiv and Zaporizhia weakened as reserves committed to eastern security, reducing depth and flexibility when Ukrainian counterattacks probed for gaps. The diversion created opportunity costs that accumulated relentlessly. Every ruble spent on railway guards was a ruble not spent on shells, drones, or troop rotations. Every soldier patrolling taiga was a soldier not holding trench or conducting assault. Every hour of engineering effort in Siberia was an hour not spent fortifying forward positions or building crossing sites for planned spring offensives. The financial burden mounted: additional fuel for patrols across thousands of kilometers, overtime pay for extended shifts, procurement of cold weather gear and equipment for new deployments, repair costs for damaged rails and rolling stock running into hundreds of millions. These funds came from budgets already strained by war spending, forcing trade-offs. reduced ammunition production, delayed modernization programs, postponed troop training rotations. Manpower costs were even more severe. Experienced units redeployed east meant inexperienced replacements at front lines, increasing casualties and reducing effectiveness. Morale suffered as soldiers assigned to guard duty in Siberia's isolation questioned purpose of war, fought far from home while homeland itself required protection. Russian quantitative superiority, more troops, more equipment, more infrastructure, became self-limiting when forced into defensive posture, protecting lines too long to defend perfectly. The Trans-Siberian and BAM together spanned over 10,000 kilometers through terrain that included permafrost, mountains, taiga, rivers, and tundra, requiring constant vigilance that no amount of troops could provide without leaving other sectors exposed. Increased guards and patrols thinned coverage elsewhere, creating new gaps that Ukrainian special forces could exploit with renewed drone strikes, sabotage, or intelligence gathering. Every additional security measure diverted resources from offense. Engineering battalions building defensive lines instead of bridges for advances, Spetsnaz guarding depots instead of conducting raids, internal troops protecting railways instead of suppressing resistance in occupied territories. The defensive posture became self-reinforcing. More protection required more resources diverted meant weaker offense. Weaker offense allowed Ukrainian forces breathing room to plan next deep strike. Next deep strike created more need for protection. This cycle, quantity forcing defensive reallocation that weakened offense, creating opportunities for further Ukrainian disruption, defined the war's asymmetric dimension. Russian superiority required sustaining vast networks. Disrupting one node forced protection of all, turning mass into burden. Ukrainian special operations exploited this. Small teams striking where mass couldn't protect, forcing Russia into defensive spiral that drained resources, eroded morale, and delayed offensives. The Khabarovsk incident wasn't isolated. It triggered pattern where each successful deep strike forced greater protection. Greater protection created new vulnerabilities invited further strikes. The legacy extended to strategic thinking. Russian commanders now planned with constant rear area anxiety, allocating forces to protection rather than concentration, hesitating on offensives fearing supply disruption, political leadership facing domestic questions about homeland security. The sabotage didn't just delay trains, it delayed victory narrative, eroded confidence, exposed limits of quantitative approach against qualitative adaptability. The diversion created opportunity costs that compounded exponentially over time. Every ruble spent on railway guards was a ruble not spent on shells, drones, or troop rotations. Every soldier patrolling taiga was a soldier not holding trench or conducting assault. The financial burden was immense. Additional fuel for patrols across thousands of kilometers, overtime pay for extended shifts, procurement of cold weather gear and equipment for new deployments, repair costs for damaged rails and rolling stock running into hundreds of millions. These funds came from budgets already strained by war spending, forcing trade-offs. Reduced ammunition production, delayed modernization programs, postponed troop training rotations. Manpower costs were even more severe. Experienced units redeployed east meant inexperienced replacements at front lines, increasing casualties and reducing effectiveness. Morale suffered as soldiers assigned to guard duty in Siberia's isolation questioned purpose of war, fought far from home while homeland itself required protection. Russian quantitative superiority, more troops, more equipment, more infrastructure, became self-limiting when forced into defensive posture, protecting lines too long to defend perfectly. The Trans-Siberian and BM together spanned over 10,000 kilometers of track through some of the harshest terrain on Earth. Permafrost, mountains, taiga, rivers, requiring constant vigilance that no amount of troops could fully provide. Increased guards and patrols thinned coverage elsewhere, creating new gaps that Ukrainian special forces could exploit. Every additional security measure diverted resources from offense. Engineering battalions building defensive lines instead of bridges for advances, Spetsnaz guarding depots instead of conducting raids, internal troops protecting railways instead of suppressing resistance in occupied territories. The defensive posture became self-reinforcing. More protection required more resources diverted meant weaker offense. Weaker offense allowed Ukrainian forces breathing room to plan next deep strike. Next deep strike created more need for protection. This cycle, quantity forcing defensive reallocation that weakened offense, creating opportunities for further Ukrainian disruption, defined the war's asymmetric dimension. Russian superiority required sustaining vast networks. Disrupting one node forced protection of all, turning mass into burden. Ukrainian special operations exploited this. Small teams striking where mass couldn't protect, forcing Russia into defensive spiral that drained resources, eroded morale and delayed offensives. The legacy extended beyond immediate logistics. Russian commanders now planned with constant rear area anxiety, allocating forces to protection rather than concentration, hesitating on offensives fearing supply disruption, political leadership facing domestic questions about homeland security. The sabotage didn't just delay trains, it delayed victory narrative, eroded confidence, exposed limits of quantitative approach against qualitative adaptability. But vast territory meant gaps persisted, Ukrainian teams finding new targets despite increased vigilance. The Trans-Siberian's length, spanning 11 time zones, crossing mountains, rivers, permafrost, ensured no complete coverage possible. Remote sections remained lightly patrolled, maintenance windows still existed, predictable patterns adapted but never eliminated. Ukrainian special forces, learning from Khabarovsk, refined techniques. Smaller teams, better cold weather gear, improved EW countermeasures against Russian jammers, alternative routes exploiting surveillance gaps in even vaster areas like Yakutia or Krasnoyarsk Krai. New operations followed, smaller derailments, signal sabotage, bridge weakening, each chipping away at reliability, forcing further resource drain into protection. Because determination, for operators defying impossible, turns quantity into liability. The team that executed Siberian Shadow accepted months of risk. -35°C taiga crossings, biometric checkpoints, jammers disrupting GPS, unscheduled patrols, timeline compression as train arrived early. They succeeded through meticulous planning, precise execution, and willingness to operate in shadows where mass couldn't follow. Their success proved small-scale precision could disrupt large-scale logistics. One junction severed delayed thousands of tons, forcing detours burning fuel Russia couldn't spare, exposing North Korean partnership's vulnerability, creating doubt permeating command from frontline to Kremlin. And precision in shadows achieves what mass in open cannot. Massive forces, divisions, air squadrons, naval task groups, require visible deployment announcing intent, predictable patterns enemies prepare against, vulnerable supply chains becoming targets. Small teams move unseen, strike surgically, withdraw before response, leveraging surprise and asymmetry to multiply effect. Khabarovsk showed this. For operators accomplished disruption divisions might fail to match without escalation risking broader conflict. We remember because for operators in darkness proved wars turn on choosing right targets, not matching numbers. They selected bottleneck where impact compounded, single track, concentrated traffic, winter conditions delaying repair, turning one train into weeks of delay, months of reconfiguration. They honored earlier sacrifices, teams lost on prior missions providing lessons refining techniques, intelligence networks built through years enabling infiltration. Because one sabotage reshaped logistics feeding entire war. Delayed munitions rippled to fronts, artillery rationed, offensives postponed, morale eroded as soldiers questioned supply reliability. Partnerships strained, North Korean deliveries vulnerable, diplomatic embarrassment when contributions destroyed on Russian soil. Doubt permeated, homeland no longer sanctuary, commanders hesitant, political narrative cracked. And Ukrainian SOF remained decisive when adaptability exploits enemy scale against itself. Vast territory, centralized control, predictable patterns, Russian strengths, became weaknesses when small teams struck deep. Adaptability, rapid learning, decentralized execution, acceptance of risk for greater gain, allowed Ukraine to turn quantitative superiority into logistical nightmare. Because determination in shadows changes wars. And precision exploiting predictable patterns remains why smaller forces endure against larger. The legacy endures. Russian logistics forever altered. Guards increased but insufficient, patrols doubled straining manpower, resources diverted to protection weakening offense. But gaps persist, Ukrainian teams continue finding targets. Because small teams with determination achieve what massive forces cannot. And Ukrainian special operations, striking where safe, remain why quantitative superiority becomes burden when facing adaptability that exploits scale against itself. If this deep dive into Ukraine's Trans-Siberian sabotage, Ghost Squad severing Russia's iron artery, hit home, smash like, subscribe with bell, comment your location and thoughts on how deep strikes reshape the war. Bold operations like this deserve spotlight. Lock in, this is Wartime Zone, next deep penetration soon.